everyone, welcome to Talk with You Zai. I'm Kelly, and we are very honored to have Paul O'Neill here today. So to begin, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Paul O'Neill, and I am an education lawyer, and I'm also a professor of education law and policy. I got into education in the first place largely because I struggled in school. When I was younger, I had disabilities that no one ever bothered to look for. So I now know that what I had was learning disabilities and something called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. Instead of having that be identified, the school just kept pushing me through grades, and I just did very poorly. And I graduated from high school at the very bottom of my class. And then I went to a community college where I figured out the only way you could get through that school without taking math, and math and foreign language and other sequencing areas are what I struggle with. So I figured out how to succeed despite my challenges, and then I went from being kind of an underperformer to a bit of an overperformer, and I went on to go to a whole bunch of fancy colleges and universities, and I went to graduate school in 4 different things, and I ended up working at a corporate law firm, a big Wall Street law firm. And I realized, I swear I'm getting back to your question of why did I get into education and why I'm doing education law. And I was working in a big law firm that had nothing to do with education work, and I was working 18 hours a day on some big litigation that I decided that I just didn't care about. Some chemical company was suing an insurance company, and I didn't care who won. And I had to think, what do I care about? And I realized that what I care about was that educational experience that I had had. Because people would come and find me and hear that I struggled in school, but I still made it okay, and they wanted to know what I had to say. And I thought, I should have an answer. And so I left the big law firm, and I took a 50% pay cut, and I went to go work in a special education nonprofit, and I had none of the credentials to get that job, but they knew that I had that disability. And so I went from that to going back to graduate school again, studying education, and then I took the education part and I combined it with the law that I had already been doing, and I became an education lawyer. I've been very happy with it. It seems like that looks like it was probably my plan all along, but it never was. I think very often careers evolve, and for me, I had to put 2 things together in order to make that work. Well, my personal experiences have shaped it a lot, because I know what it feels like to be the kid with disabilities in the back of the room who's terrified about getting the answers wrong and having everyone know that. But it also gave me a sensitivity to some of the other challenges that we see in schools, and I was much more engaged with them than I was with the things at the corporate law firm. And so things like equity, whether all kids have opportunities in school or just kids who come from families that are wealthier, whether we are focused enough about what's good for kids as opposed to what's good for adults in the system, all of that mattered to me, and it really did influence my course. And so I tried to focus on issues like that, special education in particular, but also school choice and parental empowerment. Those are all very important to me, and I try to have some kind of contribution that I can make in those areas. Well, I mean, it's no surprise that people who have less money have less choices. If you have plenty of money, then you can decide that the local district school where you would send your kid for free isn't very good, and instead you're going to send them to a private school. You're going to send them to possibly a religious private school that matches your beliefs, or just a very good school that happens to be different from what the district is offering. And in America, we have a really, really stark distinction between kids who fall into one category and kids who fall into the other category. And a lot of my work and a lot of the education reform work from the last dozen years or so has been focused on trying to do more to make sure that all families and all kids have decent options. And that is much easier to say than to do. We often use those terms together, equity and inclusion. And I think that's because they both are different aspects of fairness, but they're really pretty different. Equity, as I was describing before, describes, do some people have more than other people? But inclusion, as we usually use it, is more about whether kids with disabilities are being educated together with kids who don't have disabilities. And in the bad old days of education in America, which I would say was before 1975, we really didn't include kids with disabilities very much in the regular classroom for a bunch of bad reasons. It was stressful for everyone and it was difficult to do. But these days we focus much more on trying to make sure that we don't isolate groups of kids, especially kids with disabilities. And so we do what we can to bring them together, even though there are some kids who have disabilities that are so profound that there are limits to that. But it is a constant challenge, just as it's a constant challenge to try and provide equity to everyone. It's a constant challenge to try and create a system where inclusion is meaningful and that every kid is empowered to learn.
So I also agree with you. So all the kids deserve the right to learn, no matter like they're a student with special needs or they're from different background, and they all deserve like the same education.
Well, I mentioned two of them. Inclusion and serving kids with disabilities is certainly a constant and a very difficult challenge and a costly one. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of reasons, districts and charter schools and other kinds of public schools struggle with that. And I'm talking about public schools right now, leaving private schools out of it. So that's a huge thing. Then this question about whether every kid has an opportunity to learn, equity. That's another big thing. Another big consideration is that right now in America, we are having a real pushback on some of the supports that have been in place for many years. The administration that's in Washington, D.C. right now is pushing back on some of the reforms that other administrations have provided to families, things relating to gender identity and to race and ethnicity, and allowing folks what a lot of people think to be important supports for that. I just saw on my phone, as we were waiting to start this interview, a notice that said that history is being taught differently now under the new Trump administration because there are districts that are removing things that they used to teach because they don't think that it fits with current priorities of what people should want to focus on. And it's those kinds of issues that are controversial. I mean, because we're having this conversation today and not last year, I would say that right now, a big issue is what is the curriculum? Who's being taught what? And what kind of supports are people getting who fit into some of these categories that are controversial?
That's a lot.
There's a lot going on right now, but I'll tell you something that's frustrating. It's been a while since education was at the top of the list of political issues that candidates who are running for office and then people who are in office are focused on. It's such a hard thing to fix that I think after a while, governmental officials and people who have money to give to causes, they get kind of burned out. They get a little tired of the fact that we can't fix special education and we can't fix inequity and we can't come to an agreement on curriculum. And so they kind of de-emphasize it. And it's a funny thing to say that here's a concern about education, but my concern about education is it's not enough of a concern, that it's not a hot button issue enough for people to focus on it. And I think that it'll be like a pendulum that swings back and forth, and right now it's swung away, and pretty soon it'll swing back. But, the kids who are in school right now are suffering from the fact that it's not a high enough priority across the country. Since the mid-1990s, some states have offered parents the opportunity to choose a different kind of public school in their area that isn't run by the school district. Because the thinking was, well, if we create the ability for smart people with good ideas to create their own schools, then maybe we can give parents more good choices. Even the parents that come from low-income communities. Because you can always, if you have money, you can always send your kid to a private school, but you may not have that kind of choice if you don't. And so I think the idea behind charter schools was parental choice, and the way it ends up playing out is particularly parental choice for Black and brown families in communities where they may not have as much of an opportunity. And so charter schools now exist in almost every state. There's a couple of states that are left that don't have charter schools. And some have much more than others. California and Florida and Texas have lots and lots, and some of the states who've just done this for a little while don't have that many. But generally speaking, a charter school is a public school, not run by the district, but instead run by a board of trustees that's just brought in by the folks who founded the school, and they can create a different kind of an approach to education, and they can get freed up from some of the rules that might apply and constrain a regular district school. So sometimes what we say is that it's more autonomy in exchange for more accountability. And the accountability is that supposedly, after a handful of years, whatever the charter term is, the school can be shut down if it's not doing well. That's the accountability for charter schools. So it can be kind of an experimental thing, but you can close it. There are plenty of problems with every kind of school, and there are problems with charter schools. And one of the problems with charter schools is that once they've been opened, they can be difficult to shut down, even if they're not doing that well. And that's because communities of families believe in the school, and because politicians believe in the school. And it's just hard whenever you offer a public benefit to take it back. I'm not saying that's a problem everywhere, but it has been an issue with charter schools, and charter schools have thrived in many respects, and some of them aren't great, just like some of the district schools aren't great, and we have a mix. So everyone should be an education lawyer because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on.
Especially in law education.
It's a good question. There's a law side to everything. So there's a law side to education. There's a law side to probably sports and communications and everything that you would do. So I look at the legal side, the legal issues that come up in education. In terms of conflicts, there are always limitations to what a lawyer can do. A lawyer can't represent people who are antagonistic or have interests that don't fit with each other. So for example, if I represent a school district, I can't also represent a parent who's suing the school district because we're on sort of opposite sides of the fence. And lawyers always have to be very careful about that line. And sometimes I represent a charter school and also a company that helps run the charter school. And usually their interests are aligned because what's good for one is good for the other, but not when they're fighting each other. Right? And then there's a conflict, and then we have to find a way to decide, all right, which side do I represent here and not represent the other side? And often you have to get a waiver if you want to take work that might be close to the line. So I think that's one way to think about conflicts. More broadly, I think that you could say that there are conflicts in the world of law and education around some of the policy issues that people want to do. Is it really a good idea for families, let's say if you represent families, to have them engage in a schooling option, let's say, that seems to not serve families very well? The best example I can give is the data on school vouchers is very bad. School vouchers tend not to do well. So if I'm representing the interest of families, I would also struggle with, I mentioned before, they have some massive, some of them are charter schools, but virtual schools. The data on those schools is awful. They tend to do really poorly. While I represent charter schools, and I support families, and I think we all have to figure out, like, what am I comfortable advocating for, given who I already represent? And that's always going to be a concern.
Well, I feel privileged to be able to teach at Teachers College. I was asked to do that the semester after I graduated. I knew something about special education, and the folks who taught the law classes there asked me if I could come up with a class on special education law. And so I did that. I really enjoyed it. And then I moved from that to other areas of knowledge that cross over with things that I do in my legal practice that are interesting to me. So I have taught classes on charter schools and on private school choice and on private school law and on federal law. There is a law side to everything. And Teachers College, like every other graduate school of education, has some classes that focus on that. And it has honestly been a privilege for me to be able to have an academic approach to some of these same issues where I have a very practical, professional responsibility in my regular job and putting those things together. It's very rewarding for me, and I hope interesting for the students.
Well, in some respects, education doesn't change. Kids grow up, they need to go to school, they need to learn to read and write and do math, and that's never going to change. But there are a lot of issues right now that impact schools and children and families that have changed a lot and continue to transform. We've talked about a lot of them in the course of this conversation. And I guess I would say that I don't think a person who is training to be a teacher, whether in grad school or just on the job, can really do a terrific job unless they understand some of these issues of equity and inclusion and accountability of the system for the success of all the kids. I think it's essential if you're in school to take classes that tell you about that take classes about policy. Honestly, in a lot of graduate schools of education, so many of the classes are practical and not that many of them are policy oriented. And I think you need a mix of those two things. I think you have to have an understanding of the issues that America is facing and your state is facing and your school is facing, in addition to the basics of teaching kids. And I would also throw out that sometimes I feel as though educators can lose a sense of empathy for what families experience, and that they always have to remember that parents are in a system that they don't often feel like they are equal participants in, and maybe they don't speak the language, and maybe they don't feel like they have enough control, and they can sometimes be difficult to deal with. And I think educators have to remember that we are here to serve the families, we're here to serve the kids, and retain that level of empathy, retain that level of appreciation for why we're here in the first place.
Thank you so much, Paul, for sharing your insights today. I really appreciate your sharing and your perspective. Thank you for watching. See you next time.